You're listening to The Physician's Mind, raw stories and real talks from people striving for greatness in medicine and in life. This is where ambition meets action and where the relentless come to level up. I'm your host, Curtis Wilkerson. Thank you so much for listening. Let's get right into it. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Physician's Mind podcast. Today I'm here with Gary Kaufman, the owner of Dynasty Wealth Partners Consulting. We're here in Toledo, Ohio. Gary, how are you doing today?
Welcome to Toledo. I'm doing well.
Awesome.
Appreciate you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So will you just go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of work you do?
Yeah, happy to. So not originally from the Toledo, Ohio area. I actually grew up in Cleveland or Medina, you know where that's at. So went to the University of Toledo for a background in finance and financial services. That is where I met my lovely wife. She was a nurse at the time, has since gone on to become a CRNA, but her family's up in Michigan, my family's in Cleveland, and so we planted our flag in Toledo, and here we are. So it's us, our wonderful dog, and that's about where we're at for now.
Nice. So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you come to specialize in financial planning for physicians and surgeons?
Yeah. So 10 years ago, like I had said, kind of got into the industry, was introduced via an internship that was offered back when I was in college. And so really started there with one of the major broker dealers, got a feel for what the industry looked like, you know, what are the ins, what are the outs. And as I was looking at it, you kind of start with anybody who wants to talk about financial planning, please come talk to me, right? Because I'm trying to open up my door for services here. And as things had progressed, we really started to find that, you know, the niche we like to work with was medical families. I don't know if it's because my mom was a nurse or my wife was becoming a nurse, but that's where we found ourselves. And so over the last several years, burrowing in a lot deeper into that specialty, that's where a lot of that background started to come from.
All right. So what specific challenges did you notice in the medical world that led you to found Dynasty Wealth Partners?
Yeah. It's a good question. I would say, I think starting out, I realized that there were pretty definitive phases in a physician's life that they go through, and each one requires a different level of tact, where I feel like the normal progression for most people in their careers is they go to school, they get their undergraduate degree, maybe they go on to get something a little bit more, you know, specialized, and then they're into the workforce, they've got their career trajectory locked in, and they know where they're heading. Mm-hmm. Where most of the physicians we work with, they had undergrad, they had graduate school, right, the medical school side of things, and now they're going into residency. And so there's this long, you know, wavelength of delayed gratification, as we always like to call it. I always say folks like you are masters of delayed gratification, right? And so it's figuring out how to navigate those nuances from being a doctor in training, you know, what do I do? I'm kind of paycheck to paycheck, but I'm also working the most hours I'm probably ever going to work in my life, to this aspiring affluent physician that we work with, which are those that are normally out working full time. They just aren't worth millions of dollars yet. And then I would say that third, form of doctor that we work with are the financially independents, right? I always like to say the ones that are wearing their white coat because they get to choose to, not because they have to. Mm-hmm. And so it was just fun to figure out how to solve that puzzle because, you know, you have things that need to get done, but we don't have money to make it happen. Now we have money to make it happen, but maybe we don't have the time to get some of these things done. And then, you know, for those physicians that have amassed great amounts of wealth, it's figuring out how do we plan for the taxes around some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And through some previous discussions, you've shared that you're very big on helping physicians build a financial foundation.
Sure.
And many residents, they're drowning in debt. They have no idea where to even begin. So in your opinion, Gary, what is the first step these people should be taking to establish long-term financial success?
I think you have to, first I would say diagnose yourself in terms of, do I care to learn some of these things or do I not care to learn some of these things? Everyone we work with obviously is a super genius in their own right. And from what I've been told from my wife and then lots of our clients is a lot of medicine is self-studied or self-taught, right? So I think every doctor that we work with could do financial planning or could figure it out on their own to a certain degree if they were to commit the time, but it boils down to, do they have the time?
Sure.
So I think back to that, just defining, do you care enough to dedicate the time outside of practicing medicine to figure it out? And if not, who's going to be your lifeline? And then if you do care, you know, how do you start to take some of these steps, which is why I actually really appreciate what you do in terms of helping create financial literacy and things like that from the other folks I've seen come on your podcast. So define that first, and then easy steps you can take from there a budget's super important. It seems super remedial. But in the world of credit cards, I always make the joke, we all have financial planners in our life. My first financial planner was my grandfather.
Nice.
And his advice to me was, you don't buy anything that you can't afford to buy in cash.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a debit card and I had cash, and that's what I used growing up as my financial instruments. Well, when it came time for me to buy my first car, I couldn't get approved, right?
Yep.
And so you run into some of those issues, but I think it's super important because what I learned from that is to budget, right? I knew how much money I had. I knew what I could spend. I think a lot of people run into trouble in training with credit cards. And so that's a commonality we see between a lot of residents and fellows is they're coming out of training with credit card debt, albeit some of it unavoidable when you have to pay for some of these tests and stuff as you're approaching the end of training. But I think that's really the most important, as remedial as that sounds, is start with a budget and then, read as many books as you can and try to pay attention to the didactics that pop up about financial literacy, because I know sometimes those become the easy ones to kind of say, okay, cool, I'm on cruise control. We don't have to do any case studies today.
Right.
So that would be some of my advice there.
Okay, great. So asking yourself, do I care enough to learn about this? And do I have the time to dedicate to learning about this? Very important questions. And then really it boils down to, at least in the beginning, figuring out how to budget.
Yeah.
And then with that budget, it opens the doors to other better financial habits effectively.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely.
I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. What are some of the books that you recommend?
So I think The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel could be, if not the best book to read when you're really starting to think about like the basics of finances. It's not going to, help you navigate what's a Roth IRA or how do I do, 401k match and stuff like that. But it's going to teach through stories, what have people that have been wildly successful or hyper rich people done to blow it all? And then what have the most humble beginnings of, a librarian that's done nothing but work that their entire life amass millions of dollars of wealth.
Right.
And it usually boils down to habits.
Okay.
So I think that's a good one. Outside of that, I think The White Coat Investor has done a great service for the community. Obviously, his books are all good. And then the only other one I could think of off the top of my head that I think can be advantageous at times is Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a big one as well. Just again, mindset shifts around money. I think a lot of people view it as this beast or this dragon that they have to take on, where if they can really just start to read some of these books, you start to figure out pretty simply, all right, there's some steps to this, and if I follow these steps, I should be okay.
Yeah, all great books, So a resident or a fellow, what should they be thinking about investing while they're starting to pay down their student loans?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and everybody, your listeners will know this, depending on where you train has a huge impact. So, the reality is my internal medicine doctor that trains here in the Ohio area makes about the same as an internal medicine doctor that's training in California or New York. They might get a little bit of a pay bump, right? But it's going to be not in line with what the cost of living inflation would be there. And so don't beat yourself up. That would be the first thing I say. Now, in residency and fellowship, it doesn't mean that you have an excuse to go out and like spend on luxury goods, right? Because it can feel good. Sometimes people have that like retail therapy, I think people like to call it. So try to live within your means as much as you can. But that being said, above and beyond that, figure out what your budget is. Give yourself permission to spend. I tell residents and fellows this all the time. If you're deciding between eating ramen noodles or going out for a nice lunch with your colleagues, these are people you may not get to see for a very long time until you go back to some CME conferences and stuff like that. And this, talking with all the physicians you do, burnout's a very real thing. So I think the further you can delay some of that burnout from happening, the better. The last thing you need to do is, limp across the finish line of training and already be burnt out. So it's a fine balance, but I think if you live in a place where you can pay your bills and live a decent lifestyle and you've still got some money left over, I think the low-hanging fruit would, of course, be a Roth IRA. And taking one step back, it goes without being said, everybody, you're usually forced to do this, by the way, but take advantage of the match that you can get in your 403Bs or your 401ks. Beyond that, you want to start thinking about Roth IRAs. And I think one of the truly most untapped gems, you have to be tactful about this, but an HSA or a health savings account. And that's critical, I would say. HSA is in health, right? FSA is in frank, right? FSAs can be a little bit more dangerous. You got to use it or you lose it, where that HSA could be a triple tax-free bucket for you in the future. And there's limitations on how much you can fund into all those things. So I always say each year you delay, you can't get that time back, right? So if we can put $7,000 into a Roth IRA, if we don't do that in 2025, it's not like 2026 comes around now all of a sudden you can fund that Roth IRA.
Yeah, so you really want to take advantage of compound interest as early as possible.
If you can.
If you can, yeah. So understanding that where you train has an impact, right? You could be living in California versus in Ohio, making the same amount of money, but the cost of living is going to be tremendously different. So of course, it's going to depend on location, context.
Yep.
Limiting your excessive spending. We call that lifestyle inflation, as you know.
Yep.
Making sure you mitigate the negative implications of that. And taking advantage of some of the low-hanging fruit, the Roth IRA, the 403b, 401k, HSA, things like that. And understanding that each year you delay, that's another year that you are losing the advantages of compound interest, right?
That's exactly right. And I think for those, and I'm sure your listeners know this, any new listeners, compounding interest, I think I'm somebody that I teach through stories, or I teach through, we'll call them illustrations. So think of compounding interest. Again, we're in Ohio. It's a very hot day today. So this might be a goofy analogy, but it's a snowball effect, right? So if we start at the top of a hill and you push that snowball down, anybody that's built a snowman when they were a kid, the bigger that ball gets, the tougher it is to roll it over, but the more snow it's also picking up because of that surface area. Think about your wealth the exact same way. So I think compounding interest is thrown around all the time, but one of the first questions I always ask a physician when we sit down with them is, hey, compounding interest is the most important topic you need to understand.
Yep.
But define to me what it is, and what do you think their answer typically is? It's interest that compounds. And I'm like, well, okay, if you're not allowed to use the words in the definition, right, how would you define it? And that's where we start to get into that snowball analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. And compound interest goes beyond just finances. It goes along with your habits. It goes along with your study routines, your family life, etc. But that's a whole digression that we don't need to get into.
Absolutely.
Do you recommend aggressive loan repayment or a more balanced approach between investing and loan payoff?
Great question. You're pulling me into deep waters early, which is fine because I think this can be, we'll call it a little bit polarizing. I think it's important to have a plan. So I'd start there, and I think it's also important to give yourself options. And this translates to lots of other things in life. Using another example that I think a lot of people think of, and then we'll come back to student loans, is like, think about the home purchase that you're going to make. I hear clients all the time say, hey, 30-year fixed might be this rate, but if I do a 7-year adjustable rate mortgage, it might be this rate. But as soon as you sign up for that 7-year adjustable rate mortgage, you've limited some of your options, right? So I look at student loans the exact same way. I think, again, you have to define who am I, where am I heading?
Yep.
And then pick a course, accordingly. From what we talked about before in terms of the limitations, we'll call it, in capital and training, I think the impact you can make on your student loans by aggressively paying them down in training is not as large of an impact as you may convince yourself you're making. Where we find 9 times out of 10 in a lot of the contract consulting that we do for clients is when you're starting to have these conversations on where you're going to go full time, your student loans are actually a great tool for leverage and negotiation, because beyond just a typical sign-on bonus, you could also talk about maybe getting some form of a student loan reimbursement by signing what we like to call golden handcuffs. So instead of you signing up for like an evergreen contract where it annually renews each year, if you go to the hospital and you say, hey, I'm willing to give you 3 years of my life, right? But here's what I anticipate on the back end. We find there's a lot of give there, and there's tax incentives on both ends. So it's not like you're asking them for just, a ton of free money. It's some free money, but you're working for it. So I always recommend, don't go too aggressive because you never know what's going to happen. The same way right now, public service loan forgiveness, that's why I kind of said it's a little bit of deep waters because of what's happening politically in that climate right now. But give yourself options and don't make decisions based on what ifs, right? Wait for something to happen, then figure out how do I need to react, as opposed to react and go 4 or 5 steps down this way. Nothing actually happens the way you thought it was going to. And now you almost have to go 4 steps backwards to take steps forward over here. So, to answer, if somebody was trying to self-diagnose right now on what they should do with their student loans, my recommendation is obviously enjoy deferment while you can if it's at 0% interest. But back to the keeping up with the Joneses or lifestyle inflation, just because you don't have a student loan payment doesn't mean that all of a sudden you spend those dollars on other things. You need to walk and talk as if you're still making that student loan payment. Set that aside in some sort of buffer account, high interest earning, or anything that you can find, right? Maybe you're not putting it in Cryptocurrencies are things that can be super volatile in case you need to utilize those dollars. But then give yourself options. If lever A happens and all of a sudden forgiveness isn't there, you've got a nest egg to throw a knockout punch at those high interest earning debts. And if lever B is pulled and all of a sudden forgiveness is available or you get a good bonus, now you have a nest egg to start to buy your first car, or next car, I should say, buy your first home. So we're big believers in just having options.
Yeah.
But I very rarely can recommend any doctor in training to too aggressively attack their student loans.
Yeah,
unless you have private debt.
High interest rate, private loans, exactly. I mean, and it can be very nuanced. Of course, it depends person to person, but giving yourself the options, understanding who you are and where you're at in life. And then I didn't realize that it may not be as advantageous as one might think to pay them off aggressively during residency. I didn't even realize they had leverage potential when you're negotiating a contract.
Yeah, absolutely. I find more often than not, that's one of the biggest leveraging tools you can have, is just saying, hey, I've got all this debt. I'll paint a picture of a conversation we had with a client this year. We've had this conversation with many clients, but you're looking at a nonprofit organization and a for-profit organization. And if you know where I'm getting with this, it's public service loan forgiveness, right?
Yep.
So if you stay in that nonprofit course, let's say, you did orthopedics and you've got 6 to 7 years of training under your belt. Well, you're 3 years away, right, from that golden gate of all that loan, washing away. Where if you chose to go to a for-profit practice, all of a sudden you're saying, hey, those 7 years of PSLF credits mean nothing to me anymore. And so for you to be able to go to that for-profit organization and say, hey, if I took this nonprofit job over here, and let's just, for argument's sake, say they have a $300,000 loan balance remaining, that's the equivalent of an extra $100,000 of comp over those 3 years.
Right.
Because when that debt gets forgiven, that's $300,000 they no longer had to pay. So I would go to that for-profit organization and say, hey, I just need you to understand this is what I'm giving up to come join you over here. And so what can we do to try to make me as whole as possible, right? And maybe you're not going to get the full $300,000, but maybe you get an extra $150,000 over 3 years. That can make a big difference. And of course, there's other factors, right? How are you compensated on the for-profit side versus the nonprofit side? And the hopes would be is maybe you're earning a little bit extra dollars over there. But that's why it's definitely important to analyze those things.
Yeah, and you've just given me the idea. Maybe we'll have to do another episode on negotiating contracts as physicians.
I think it's one of the most important things. What I have found, and again, I will always say this and give flowers where they're due, all the clients I work with are super geniuses in their own right. I think the last thing most are taught, and who knows, right? You could, put your tinfoil hat on for a second and say maybe it's like the larger organizations in the medical world are saying, hey, let's not teach these folks how to negotiate these contracts so we can keep paying them the way we're paying them. But most have not been taught, unless, and again, that's why I love what you're doing with this podcast. Like, how do I think like a business owner? How do I think like an investor? And how do I take off my physician cap for a second and think like HR?
Yes, you got to be able to adapt to those different situations.
Yeah.
Tell me, what are some of the biggest financial mistakes you see young doctors making early in their careers?
Yeah, a couple. I think the low-hanging fruit, we've talked about a couple times here would be, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality. I think if you're continuously, saying, hey, XYZ has this car in the physician's lot, so I need to have this car in the physician's lot, you're setting yourself up to probably never being fully satisfied with where you're at financially, because somebody's always going to have something nicer than you are. And, the secret behind that is their situation at home is probably a lot different than yours is. Some are probably similar, but you don't see their bank account statements, their balance sheets, how much credit card debt they have. You just see the car and you go, oh, they must be killing it.
Yep.
Right. And so I think that would be one of the biggest mistakes. Outside of that, it's really just lack of understanding around the tax game. The transition from residency to full-time, you're going to go from effectively right now, maybe a 12 to 20% tax bracket, upwards of 35 to 37, and that's without even adding in any state income tax. If you are not, no pun intended, surgical, right, about how you navigate the tax code and how that, can be leveraged in your favor, I think that's the biggest mistake. And that could be things from like not understanding that you should max out your 403B, but also key caveat here, I'll throw some quick hits out here that, maybe we can come back to, or just make sure people go back and listen, would be if you don't have a catch-up provision in your 401k or 403b, which very rarely have I seen that happen. I find a lot of clients will say, well, I'm just going to max my $23,000 out into my 401k in the first 3 months out of the year. That way, the next 9 months, I feel like I'm making more money, right? So they're like, squirrel away as much wealth as I can at the beginning, and then I'll feel richer the rest of the year. Well, they stop matching you those other 9 months if you don't have a catch-up provision.
Mm.
So you could be giving up free money, right? Dr. A maxes out his 401k January to December each year. Dr. B maxes it out January to March, and they don't have a catch-up provision. Dr. A has way more money than Dr. B, even if they funded the exact same accounts, exact same funds, everything. So I think that's a huge common mistake. Outside of that, be careful depending on the organization you work for, but deferred comp can be a powerful tool, right? So the 457 accounts that people will hear of, that's an extra $20,000 plus of tax deferment. I will say this, God bless all the CPAs out there. We love them. We work with a lot of them, right? We do a lot of tax consulting in our firm. But if your CPA is telling you now that you're a full-time doctor, you can no longer fund a Roth IRA, there's usually good cause for you to maybe think about your working relationship there, because the backdoor Roth would be a big benefit to you as well. Sometimes we'll do didactic talks around the country, and an attending will raise their hand in the back when I'm talking about Roths, and they're like, hey, just know everybody, you can't do a Roth once you go full-time. And I'm like, we have to talk after this session. You're not in trouble, right? But we should probably have a little bit of a chat when we get out of here. So I would say those are some of the quick hits. I had taken a few other notes down when I was reflecting on this, last night, but I would really say that's probably some of the biggest ones that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's good. And it goes to show the value of having a mentor financially, because doctors don't have a lot of time to be looking into 401k, 403b, 457 plans. They're like, what? I'm too busy studying the musculoskeletal system or whatever you may be doing in that moment. So it demonstrates the value of a financial mentor for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you, let me rephrase that here. If you could sit down with every first-year resident in the country for just 5 minutes, what would you tell them about money?
I'm long-winded, so that's difficult. But I would say really rehashing some of the stuff we said before. Don't look to your left, don't look to your right and compare yourself with others. Comparison's the thief of all joy. That's what I was always taught growing up. I try to tell that to all of our clients as well. But just focus on where you're at. And have what I would like to call a goals-based financial plan. And that falls with everything in your life. What you want is going to be completely different than what somebody else wants. You've walked the same path most of your life, and I think that's the issue we all fall into, but specifically with physicians, it's like everybody that's in your cohort has walked very similarly the same life that you have, at least professionally, right? Everybody's got different family makeup, different problems, everybody's got their own thing personally, but professionally, you all went to medical school, right? You all are in the same training program. You had to go through the same interview to get to where you're at, but your life is so different than theirs. And so I think just reminding yourself of that constantly so that you can really focus on what do you need to do, not what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Comparison is the thief of joy, most definitely. So Gary, let's talk tax strategy and investment planning.
Fun. Yeah.
What are some of the tax traps that high-income physicians fall into, and how can they avoid them?
Yeah, this is a good one. I had to narrow it down. I had like 15 on this because I think that could be its own complete separate thing. But just a couple ones that I was thinking of initially. It's the not maxing out your pre-retirement or pre-tax retirement accounts at work, right? So back to the 401ks, 403bs, the 457 accounts. Make sure that you always check with your employer if you have the options to do. And I laugh when I hear this said out loud, but the super mega backdoor Roth IRA. Right? In my world, I always think of like a Roth IRA with a Superman S on its chest when I hear that. Mm-hmm. But that can be a really great account as well. So make sure you're checking if you can do that, which is just ultimately you make a post-tax contribution into your 401k on top of your pre-tax contribution, and then automatically converts into a Roth on the back end.
Nice.
So that's pretty big.
Nice.
Doing the backdoor Roths, I think is huge. I would say as far as like tax faults, that's like the low-hanging fruit. Most physicians of ours have some sort of side hustle, right? So whether it is a 1099 shift at a hospital that's a little bit outside of your normal, radius, or real estate investing, like I've seen a lot of, your listeners have probably heard from some of the other folks that you've had on the podcast. If you're not thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead on how you can set up the right type of entity structure for said side hustles, you are leaving a ton of tax alpha on the table. We were giving a talk here locally with some physicians, and the common thing that kept popping up for them was, well, I keep hearing that I'm a highly compensated W-2, but what can I do for taxes aside from like the low-hanging fruit we had just mentioned? And the answer is start a business, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that you start a full-time business, but even being able to pick up a contract where maybe you pick up 5 extra shifts a year, that's 1099, well, you can now be a business owner. Or buying a couple real estate properties, right? That takes a little bit longer to get to that point. But once you have a few real estate properties, you're now a business owner. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we've noticed, and that goes deep, right? I'll give you an example of a client we were talking to just a couple weeks ago, interventional radiologist, full 1099, traveling all over the country. No entity formation set up yet, receiving all of it as personal income. And so by him setting up an entity and starting to pay himself a salary, he's able to avoid some of that self-employment tax. His wife, who is a wonderful individual, is doing a lot of his scheduling and figuring out what hotels he's going to stay in and maintaining his calendar. And she's also running the whole household with their kids. Well, that is a unpaid job. Granted, it is a super worthwhile job, right? And without it, we would need other people in our lives. But why would he not hire her as his executive assistant?
Wow.
Right? Because if she's running his calendar and doing all of these things, the reality is she is his executive assistant. She's just unpaid, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure he complains about his work life to her, just like I complain to my wife about work life when it's not going well. So, you know, she has a role in the business, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so then by employing her as an executive assistant, we're able to create pre-tax retirement accounts for her as an employee where they could then defer more income into, say, a solo 401k for the two of them, or maybe a SEP IRA.
Yeah.
So just little nuances like that commonly get overlooked because you're so busy in the trenches of what you're doing every single day that it's hard to pick your head up. And I think that correlates as well with what I would say the biggest tax fault is we find for most of our clients. Everybody does tax planning in December. So it's like, once my W-2s start to come in, once my 1099s start to come in, once my 1098, right? We can list off all these different tax forms. And then they go to their CPA and they say, here you go. Like, hopefully I don't owe you too much this year. Hopefully I get some back. Well, guess how much they can do at that point? Nothing.
Yeah.
Because the year's over, right? Tax year's from January to December. So for all of our clients, we encourage them and we sit down actually in Q4 to look ahead for the next 12 months to say, what needs to happen over the next 12 months of 2026 to make sure that we get you this amount of money back on your taxes this year, or we lessen your tax load by this amount. And that could be well, we're going to set up an entity in Q1. And then by Q2, we're going to make sure we have all these qualified retirement accounts open, right? And so just like laying the groundwork. Or if a client's going to sell a big piece of real estate, you might have had some of your folks on your podcast talk about this. How are we planning for a tax-free exchange of that real estate before we're even putting it up for sale, right? So I think the more foresight you can have, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, and when it comes to tax refunds, the optimal number is 0 refund or for what you owe. Because my understanding, and please shed some light on this if this is inadequate, but obviously if you're owing the government money, you haven't optimized your tax strategy sufficiently. And if you're getting a refund, you've effectively loaned the government money interest-free for the year. And so neither of those are optimal, and that's why it's best to strive for an even 0.
Yeah, I think it's best to strive for net neutral. It is funny to see the differences, and this goes back to that Morgan Housel book, right? The Psychology of Money, because you talk to one person and they say exactly that. I can't believe I gave the government, say they got a refund for 20 grand. I can't believe I gave the government $20,000 all year and didn't collect any interest on this, right? That's one mindset. The other mindset is, oh, cool, this is going to be all of our holiday gift shopping this year, or birthdays or whatever else, and they look at it as kind of like a bonus, right? So some view it like super positively, where if they didn't get any money back, they feel bitter. And then some feel like they got some back and then they are bitter, right? So I would say, yeah, net neutral is about where you want to be. If anything else, obviously, you know, for a lot of our clients, when they sit down with us and come into our ethos, that first year or two afterwards, they're actually going to get some money back, because typically you can amend at least the last 3 years of tax returns.
Sure.
And that would be the other advice I give people too. You know, think about how long your relationship has been with your CPA. And again, they're all great people. I don't think anybody should assume anybody's doing anything nefarious, because that's usually not the reality. But think about what your CPA has to endure every single year. They get thousands of returns thrown on their desk from January till April. They have to push paper from the left side of the desk to the right side of the desk and put a check in the box to say, hey, you either owe us this or we're giving you some back. Very rarely have I ever seen a CPA sit down and think about tax strategy. They do tax filing. Those are two different things. So I think it's super important that you think about, you know, if I've worked with a CPA for the last 3 to 4 years, when's the last time I've had somebody, a tax strategist, look to see if there's anything I could amend on these returns. And a simple piece of that, Ohio is a little bit weird. There's some different things that you can do. But one of the common things we had seen with some docs around here is they have an out-of-state tax filer because they picked it up when they were in residency or fellowship and they just never changed the relationship. They moved to a new state. Maybe they're not as familiar with that state's tax laws. And so there's some things that can get overlooked.
Sure.
So that would be my general advice there.
Okay. So how does Dynasty Wealth Partners optimize a physician's tax strategy while helping them grow wealth?
Yeah. So traditionally, and I'll take a small step back because I think it's maybe helpful in terms of thinking about what the working relationship looks like. It's a silly analogy. Again, I've mentioned I'm kind of full of those, but I always say view our firm like a concierge family medicine doctor for your financial plan. So the first meeting when we sit down with our clients, before we even talk about any numbers, which usually they come up very quickly, right? But tell me about the aches and pains you're experiencing. Like what's going on in your life right now that you feel like is not going as well as it could be? And what are you already currently doing to try to fix that, right? So what medications are you on? What exercises are you doing? And then what we do is we'll go back and we'll run some labs and some tests and we'll do a full audit of the financial picture. So I think most of our clients, what they forget is they are a small business, right? So the average small business with 3 to 4 employees in the US, I think makes $300,000 to $400,000 a year, right? And so if you think about most of our physicians that are working full time, they're a small business, right?
Yeah.
Employee of one, but they're a small business, but they don't have a CFO. So what we come in is we act as that fractional CFO to say, okay, how do we audit everything you have going on? And the low-hanging fruit is always, let's look at the defensive structures. So what's your property and casualty insurance look like? You've probably picked up a bunch of disability insurance while you've been in training. Maybe you've got some life insurance. Maybe you've got umbrella coverage. You know, have you optimized these things? And I'm victim to that. We just bought a new house this year. I should follow our own process at least once a year as well, because I was overpaying on a lot of my liability coverages. It was like, okay, cool. If I can free up an extra couple $1,000s this year, why wouldn't I?
Right.
And then from there, part of that defensive audit as well is always the last 3 years tax returns, right? What are the low-hanging fruits that maybe we've missed? The ones that we see most often with W-2 physicians is they were doing the standard deduction and not itemizing. A lot of doctors we work with are very charitably inclined, right? Usually there's some things above bar that they care about. And so between their charitable giving, their mortgage interest, their property taxes, a lot of people forget you can itemize those things. And most physicians of ours are buying big enough houses where the property taxes involved in the mortgage interest on those things set themselves above that standard deduction. But when a CPA gets your stuff, again, they're just pushing stuff from the left side to the right side. Maybe they didn't catch something like that. So once we figure out where we can free up a bunch of money, then we figure out how do we deploy those extra dollars that you were already not receiving into different financial instruments that could then help you grow on the wealth side. And if there's still a little bit of a gap there, so we always back to goal-based financial plans. If somebody were to come to you today and say, hey, you know, how much money should you be saving for your financial independence? I think most people that have at least started by reading these books or listening to podcasts would say maybe 20 to 25% of their income. It's usually a pretty good knee-jerk answer.
Sure.
But is it? And I tell clients all the time, you know, if I'm sitting down with, you know, let's say a spine doc, well, maybe they need to save 5% of their income to be on track for their goals. And I might sit down with somebody that's an internal medicine hospitalist that needs to save 30% of their income to be on track for their goals.
Yeah.
And people listening to that might think, okay, well, now he's just picking a little bit to say like, well, the spine surgeon makes more money, so he only needs to save 5%, and the internal medicine makes so much money, but he needs to save 30. It has nothing to do with their income. It's still based on their goals.
Right.
So I have some doctors that are okay living off of $100,000 a year. And I've got some doctors that are going to need a couple Porsche 911s in the garage to feel satisfied with where they're at in life. And obviously the level of wealth they're going to need to save is quite a bit different.
Yeah, it depends on the individual, as always.
Yeah. And so I think that's the most important thing is have a baseline, right? Start somewhere. That's the most important thing I think everybody should take from this. Like do something. But if you haven't sat down and really analyzed what do I need to do personally, you're still always going to be asking yourself. I've sat down with doctors with $5 million in their 401k and they're like, am I okay? And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, yeah, you're doing fine, right? But okay to what, right? Like what does okay mean to you? So I think defining that is always important. But that's really how we're helping people grow on both sides.
Sure. And in your experience, what have been some of the best ways you've seen physicians build wealth outside of the traditional retirement accounts? Like if you were to share some strategies with the audience, things they may be able to look into.
Yeah. So let's start with like low-hanging fruit and bounce through all those to make sure people can put a check in the box. So you're maxing out your 401k and your 403b. You're maxing out your HSAs if you can still access them. You're maxing out your Roth IRAs. You're probably putting a good amount of money in a non-qualified brokerage account, right? Think like taxable investment account. And then you sit there and you ask yourself, what else is there?
Yeah.
And of course, there's no limit to non-qualified and taxable brokerage accounts. You could put $2 million in there if you'd like. But that being said, as our clients start to grow in their financial sphere, they'll all become eventually what I like to call accredited investors, which is either just an income threshold or an assets threshold. And every full-time physician is typically going to qualify just from an income threshold alone. But that's when you start to open up, we'll call more complex financial instruments. So private credit, private equity. Most people have heard of stocks. Most people have heard of bonds, right? That's what everybody gets access to. Private equity is just the private version of stocks. So it'd be if you and I were going to go invest in a company that's maybe not public yet, but plans to go public, hopefully. Or private credit would be the private side of bond instruments. And so those can lead to higher yields. Obviously, there's a little bit more volatility and risk. There's usually a little bit more of a lockup because if I own private equity in a company, unless I can find somebody to buy that from me, it's very difficult to sell depending on what the operating agreement looks like, where if you and I own Coca-Cola shares, as soon as the market opens, which it's open now, we can click the sell button and get our money out.
Yep.
So I think that's a great alternative that we're seeing a lot of clients utilize right now. It's been super lucrative the last couple of years. Real estate, whether it's you want to own real estate personally or through the form of a syndicate.
Yep.
And so I think, owning real estate personally, just remember this as well. We keep talking about like the common theme of, keeping up with the Joneses, but everybody always tells you their highlight reel. So make sure that you have some like real friends, real colleagues, real mentors. I like the way that you put it, that are going to tell you all the terrible things and maybe change how you ask about stuff as well. Like when you're analyzing an investment or when you're analyzing a decision you're going to make, it sounds weird, and I'm certainly the furthest thing from a pessimist. I'm very much so like to think of myself as an optimist, but start asking, what on earth can go wrong?
Right.
Like if I'm going to buy this rental property, what's the absolute worst thing that's going to happen? And by the way, what are some of the worst things that have happened to you? Because I want to hear about the basement flooding and how it cost you $5,000. I want to hear about the tenants that didn't pay, that you had to evict, that lived there for 6 months without paying you any rent. You know what I mean? Like I want to hear about that. That way I can at least digest and swallow it to say, okay, if that happens, I'm okay, but I'm still going to buy this property because there's reasons above all the bad things that could happen on why I want to buy it. Where if you're in the physician's lounge or you're in the OR, clients will come to me all the time and they're like, Gary, this one guy, he's got 12 properties. He's completely financially independent if he'd like to be. And I'm like, that's amazing. And he probably is, but you're seeing his highlight reel. Like what you're not seeing is the times where he had to go over there and fix the toilet because it was jiggling or something like that. Or like had to pay somebody to go fix the toilet, like it's a headache.
Yeah.
So I think you have to define like if you're okay with doing some of that, because until you get so large with systems of scale, it's hard to make yourself irrelevant in some of those areas where when you've got 10 properties, you can make yourself fairly irrelevant, right? Where real estate syndicates, they give you the exposure to buy into real estate, still have ownership and equity through being a limited partner. And now you're getting a K1 distribution, which then would allow you to take advantage of some extra tax advantages there as well. And so I think, again, it's just knowing who you are, kind of defining yourself and figuring out, all right, do I want to buy real estate and own it personally, or would I like to own it at an arm's length, right? So real estate syndicates, private credit, private equity, above and beyond that, these are a little bit beyond the basics, which is what your question originally was. But things like direct participation programs through oil and gas drilling. Again, super high risk. Could be a big reward because if they drill into the ground and there's no oil there, you lose all your money, right? So maybe you avoid doing some of those things unless you've got some extra money to blow. But cash balance plans as well. Those are kind of, I like to think of as a little bit of a hidden treat that most of our owner-operator physicians are not leveraging, which can be a lot of extra tax deferment as well.
Cool. Yeah. So there's obviously no shortage of options.
No, there's plenty of options.
Yeah. And on the topic of the negative imagery you discussed, I think that's what the Stoic philosophers call it, the negative imagery. You imagine the worst thing that could happen, and then you start with that.
Yep.
And then once you've imagined the absolute worst thing that can happen and you experienced in your mind how you're going to go through that situation, then you can attack.
1,000%.
So is there a story, Gary, of a physician's life that you saw completely change once they got smart with their finances?
There's several. I can think of. I do think to a certain degree, I have these conversations so often at times, maybe I become numb to the impact it has until somebody thanks me. And then it makes me realize, oh my gosh, wow, like this was the impact that we had. One that I had thought of when I was reading through these things in preparation for our conversation today is I'm thinking specifically, she was an emergency medicine doctor, 3 kids at home, working like an absolute dog, as most doctors do, specifically those that are in emergency medicine, right? It's high burnout. I think the highest burnout, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong, but it's definitely one of those that's up there for physicians.
I think you're right.
And so, for her, back to that goal-based financial plan, when she came into our ethos, she was already, again, crushing it, working like a dog, making tons of money, maxing out all of her accounts. She actually already had an entity set up for her 1099, income and everything. But she just felt lost as far as like the vision of it all. I want to pay for my kids' schooling. I want to make sure they don't have anything to worry about. I want to make sure I'm on track for financial independence so I can choose to work and not have to work one day. And in digging into a lot of these things, she was working so hard to accomplish all these financial goals, but what she was sacrificing behind the scenes is she wasn't at all the games she wanted to be.
Yep.
Or she wasn't at all the performances she wanted to be at. And so when we sat down and we ran these math models for her, again, we could put a check in the box that she was already doing a lot of amazing things. But what we were able to bring to her was just the clarity of, hey, you're working at about what we would call like 100% FTE right now, right? Full-time schedule. If you dropped down to 60 to 70% of your current schedule, you could still float your lifestyle. You'd be on track for your financial independence goals. You could still pay for all of your kids' education. You're not losing anything. The only thing you're losing is the extra like $150,000 that shows up in your bank account that you just told me you have no idea what you're going to do with it anyways. And, I always tell clients this, we're blessed in the amount of, physicians we work with. So sometimes I think they think it's a little bit of like a conflict for me to say this to them, because I think what they're waiting for me to say is like, hey, cool, you got another $150,000, bring it on over, we'll manage it for you. But the reality is sometimes I'd rather tell clients, stop working for it, right? Like you could always invest that extra $150,000. Like we just mentioned in the question before, there's no shortage of options, but maybe that $150,000 is best served buying back your time.
Yeah.
Because your time is the most valuable thing. I think I still have yet to do this. I've heard stories of it, and I really want to make time in my life to make this a priority. But I've always been told, go donate your time or go commit some time to working in like retirement homes, right? And just talk with people that have kind of walked the walk that you are on and ask them what their biggest regrets would be, or if they could go back, what would they do? And they're all going to tell you they wish they didn't take life as seriously as they had, right? Freed up more time for their family and their friends, because at the end of the day, we're all going to die, right? Not to be too blunt about it all, but we all are. We don't know when that day is going to come. And so that to me was probably one of the most transformative relationships we've had, because then what I've got to see her do over the last couple of years is now when we're talking, we're planning the Disney trip vacations, or we're planning these different things for her and her kids to go experience together that I know had we not met, she probably would have continued to delay and then maybe been able to enjoy those with her grandkids in the future when she was retired, but certainly not her kids today.
Yeah. You don't want to live on the deferred life plan. I mean, putting death at the forefront of your mind, it's like beginning with the end in mind, similar to the negative imagery. You put that in the beginning and then you recognize, okay, well, that gives me the impetus to truly live. I mean, I worked as an EMT and I saw that frequently. Guys that were too crippled to walk, too crippled to live. Like it was too late for them.
Yeah.
They were done. And it's like you said, we all have our time. All of our moments will come where we can no longer experience this life. So we better make the most of it while we've got it.
Yeah.
And that boils down to optimizing work and lifestyle. And you can do that with adequate financial planning. Absolutely.
100%. Especially, we poke fun at the Midwest, but I just always laugh. So many of the doctors I work with here, they are some of the best paid physicians in the country because nobody wants to live in Cornfield, Ohio, right? But that being said, they're here for a reason, whether it be family or that's where the contract was or whatever else. There comes a point where it's like you have enough.
Yeah.
Right. And I think those that seek out conversations like this, there's those that are like, hungry. I need this. And that's not a bad thing if that's who you are. I'm a business owner by trade. I always want to reach these next levels. But at some point you sit back and you say, hey, I'm good. And there's another great book, less about like financial planning, but more something that I've just worked through the last couple of years. I actually just went back and read it again for the second time, or listened to it, because that's what I'm doing now, is The Gap and the Gain by Dan Sullivan. And if you've not heard of this book, I would highly recommend it for yourself with all the amazing things that you're doing. But it just talks about how if we're always chasing the horizon, what happens? Well, the horizon keeps moving.
Yep.
It never stays in place. And so how do you make sure you know where your goals are and to put those stakes in the ground between you and this horizon that you're chasing? That way, when you get there, it's not necessarily an excuse for you to stop running, right? And that's what I think is really important about the book. But it's a great excuse for you to sit down, turn around and look behind you and, you know, pardon my French, but to say, holy crap, right? So maybe not full French, but close, but like, holy crap, look at everything I've done, right? Look at what I've accomplished. And to just sit in that and give yourself grace and empathy for what you had to go through to get there so that you can recharge and then keep moving towards the next thing. And that's what I really love. I've learned our superpower is building perspective for most physicians we work with because they didn't have a goal, right? They had said differently, they had a goal. It wasn't defined.
Right.
Or they thought it was defined, but it was half defined. And so really helping them get crystal clear on what that is, knowing what they need to do to drive those results, and then also help them reflect and just appreciate life. And everybody needs that, not just doctors, like, right? Like anybody that would be listening to this needs to be told that message, but most specifically those that are working as hard as you guys are.
Most definitely. Yeah, it illustrates the importance of having a clear vision, because that clear vision of basically imagining the most difficult thing you can do with your life and committing yourself to taking full responsibility to achieving the greatest things you can achieve pretty much enables every day to be supercharged with meaning, because you can view each day as a challenge, or a series of challenges rather, that you can attack in order to make small progress towards your goal, which is way off in the distant future. So rather than constantly looking off into the future, you can look at each day as that series of obstacles to be overcome. And then you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can live in the moment, you can enjoy the day, but also move towards your vision that's far off into the future. And it's important, like you mentioned, to maintain a focus on the moment each step along the way towards that Jacob's ladder of never-ending climb towards the goal.
Yeah. And I was reminded of this, you know, and I love what you said before, like have a mentor, have a coach, right? So I'm nowhere near perfect, right? I've got tons of room left to grow, but that's why I have always hired coaches for each stage of my business. And I was reminded of that from that dinner I was telling you about, where we were talking with these physicians here in town. And I'm just excited, right? We finished up that dinner. We've got lots of new great business opportunities. We're ready to attack this head on. And my coach had just said, hey, give yourself a second to breathe. And what would the Gary of you 10 years ago think about what the Gary of you today, right, just did with all of the, you know, monumental growth that you guys have been having? And I'm like, I didn't even think about that, right? And then I felt great the entire weekend because I was like, all right, cool. Instead of me thinking about like the 25 extra things I need to get done, they were still at the forefront of my mind, but I could just sit there and say, hey, we're doing some pretty cool things right now. I think everybody needs that.
Yeah, most definitely. Moments to pause and reflect, and then there's moments to grind. Absolutely. Yep. So Gary, rapid fire as we wrap up here, 3 final questions. What is one financial myth that you wish every doctor would stop believing?
That's a good question. I had a couple of them down. The biggest one I would say is wealth isn't built by income, it's built by habits. And we talked a lot about that today, but the most common, we'll call it rebuttal I get or pushback I get when it comes to jumpstarting somebody's financial future is, oh, I'll worry about that when this happens, right? Meaning, oh, I'll think about my contract once I actually have some stuff to look at, right? Or I'll think about my retirement once I get that first big paycheck. Or I'll think about retirement once my student loans are paid off. Or once I have my first kid, once I have my second kid, once I'm done having kids, right? So there's always going to be a good excuse not to do something, but there's never a good excuse to not start building the habits or the financial literacy today, which is what we talked about. Even if you're not going to have any money to invest the next couple of years in training, you better at least start training yourself or teaching yourself on where can I put these things when it does materialize, or that mountain is just going to continue to pile up and feel like a larger and larger beast to tackle. And we're all going to get busier as life goes on. I've certainly up to this point, like with everything I've done in my life, I've never found myself having more time to focus on things. It's always I've had less time now than I ever had before. And I think that's just common with, you know, growing up, whether it both be personal or business. So that would be the biggest thing, is just wealth doesn't dictate, or income doesn't dictate wealth. Your habits are going to directly correlate to the wealth that you have.
Excellent. Yeah. Wealth is built not by income, but by habits. So start now. Is there a book, habit, or mindset shift that has made a significantly large difference in some physician clients of yours?
I think it's that psychology of money. We take that a lot to the didactic sessions that we give, and I just have clients really read and reflect on that, and then usually give me some notes. I think in the world of AI we live in nowadays, you go on ChatGPT or any of these other ones and say, hey, give me like the 15-minute summary of Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. And I say that jokingly, but I find myself falling victim to this as well. A lot of the physicians I work with will say, Gary, if you know how we do things, we hate to read. Like, we have to read a lot. So inevitably, we hate to read a lot of things that don't pertain specifically to the thing that we need to take care of right now.
Yep.
And so, creating some shortcuts on some of that stuff's important. But I would say definitely that book, I think, drives some pretty big impacts in people's lives on how they think about money and wealth. Psychology of Money.
Absolutely. So, Gary, where can listeners go to learn more or reach out to you for a financial game plan review?
Yeah. Look me up on the socials. I'm probably one of the youngest Garys you're going to ever find online. So if you look up Gary Kaufman, just look for the youngest one you can find. It's probably me.
Love it.
But dynastywp.com, that's our website. We're actually in the pursuit right now. A big thing I was challenged on by my coaches this year was digital footprint. And so really appreciate you for having us on, because this is really like the stepping stones of some of that. We've started to shoot a bunch of content, so we'll be posting that here shortly on some of our different socials, getting them out more into the podcast space. So we'll be promoting some of that and really starting to create some coursework for those that want to plug in as well. So, but yeah, feel free to reach out. More than happy to point you in the right direction. And if we can't be a resource, we've got a pretty vast, network of specialists that I'm always happy. I always say my Rolodex is your Rolodex. So even when it comes to physicians that are like, hey, I'm looking for a new family medicine job on the East Coast, but I know nobody. Who do you have? I love to always be able to open up those doors.
Absolutely.
So
the value of networking.
You got it.
All right, Gary. Thank you for joining the Physician's Mind.
Appreciate it, brother.